The notice was nailed to Della Rourke's barn door with a horseshoe nail, and whoever had driven it had turned the nail over first and used the clinch end, so the paper hung there on a hook of iron like something caught. She found it at 5:30 in the morning of the 21st of March, 1885, walking out with a lantern in one hand and a bucket of scalded bran in the other. The lantern light went across the words twice before her eyes caught up to them. She set the bucket down in the frozen mud. She read it a third time with her thumb under each line, the way her mother had taught her to read a bill of sale. By order of the Stock Committee of the Board of Commissioners of Ash Fork County, Wyoming Territory, the gray stallion kept by Mrs. D. Rourke on Cottonwood Creek was declared unsound in the hock, unfit for public service, and a menace to the improvement of horse stock in the said county. The animal was not to be advertised, not to be stood at any crossroads, mill, or livery in the county, and not to be bred to any mare, not the property of the said Mrs. Rourke. The order was signed by a veterinary surgeon named Aurelius Kemp of Cheyenne, whom Della had never met, and who had never in his life laid a hand on her horse. Underneath the signature, in a clerk's careful copperplate, somebody had written the date the order took force. It was the 21st of March. That morning, they had not given her so much as a week. She folded the paper along the creases already in it and put it in her apron pocket. Then she worked the horseshoe nail out of the door with her fingernails, because it was a good nail, and she had exactly 9 of them left in the coffee tin on the shelf, and she put that in her pocket too. Inside the barn, the gray stallion had his head over the stall door, and he had been watching her the whole time. They called him Gray Tom in that country, and had for 5 years, since Emmett Rourke came back from the Chicago stockyards in the fall of 1879, leading a horse he had bought for $65 and a set of harness. He was a Percheron, or near enough that nobody in Ash Fork County had ever argued the point. He stood 16 hands and 3 inches at the withers, and weighed something over 1,900 pounds in working flesh, and he was a dapple gray going lighter every year. The way the grays do, the dapples on his barrel like coins seen through water. He had a head as broad across the forehead as a shovel blade, a chest you could set a dinner plate on either side of the breastbone, and a black mane that fell past the point of his shoulder, thick as a woman's wrist, uncut since the day he came, because Emmett had liked the look of it, and Della had never once had the hour to spare. He was 9 years old that spring. He had never been sick a day. He had never taken a lame step in 5 years, and Della Rourke knew every step he had taken, because she had taken most of them beside him. She let herself into the stall and ran her hand down the near hind leg, from the stifle to the hock to the fetlock, feeling for the heat and for the hard swelling a spavin makes on the inside of the hock, where the bone knits itself into a knot. There was nothing. There had never been anything. She stood up and put her forehead against his shoulder for a moment, and the horse turned his head and breathed on the back of her neck, and she said out loud, to nobody, "Well, somebody looked at you. Anyhow, that was the part that told her what it was. A man does not pay a Cheyenne veterinary surgeon to travel 200 miles and swear a false certificate against a horse he has not noticed." Somebody had noticed. The Rourke place lay 6 miles up Cottonwood Creek from the town of Bellamy, on a bench of good bottom ground with hay meadow along the water and a stony hill behind it that was worth nothing at all except that it broke the wind. There were 480 acres in it, of which Emmett had proved up on 160 and bought the rest with borrowed money in 1880, when beef was high and every man in the territory was rich on paper. There was a log house with a shingle roof and a frame lean to add it on. There was a barn Emmett had built too big for what they owned, because he had been a man who built for the ranch he intended to have. There was a corral of peeled poles, a hay corral, a spring house, and a windmill that ran 2 days out of 3. There were 31 head of cattle, which was what remained of 160 after the hard winter and after the note payments, and there were 19 horses. 11 of the horses were brood mares. 4 were work geldings. 3 were saddle stock. 1 was a yearling filly Junie had named without asking anybody, and 1 was Gray Tom. Emmett Rourke had been dead 3 years and 2 months. He had gone through the creek ice in January of 1882 with a load of cottonwood on a sled and a doubletree that snapped, and the horses had come out and he had not, and by the time Ambrose Peck got him to the house he was blue to the elbows, and by the 3rd day the pneumonia had him. He was 36 years old. He had left his wife a ranch worth more than they owed on it in a good year, a daughter of 7, and a stallion he had bought out of a Chicago sale pen because the horse had a kind eye and nobody else would bid. The note came due every October at the Stockmen's National Bank of Bellamy. $640, principal and interest. 3 years running, Della Rourke had made it. She had made it in 1882 by selling the last of Emmett's steers at a loss. She had made it in 1883 by breaking and selling 9 head of green horses, and by taking in washing from the section crew when the spur came up the valley, which she had never told a living soul and never would. She had made it in 1884 by the width of a hair and by borrowing $60 from Sol Petrie, the blacksmith, which she had paid back in shoeing. She was not going to make it in 1885 on cattle. That was the plain arithmetic she had done at the kitchen table in February, with a stub pencil on the back of a feed bill. Beef was down. Her cows were down. What she had that the valley wanted, and would pay cash money for, was standing in her barn eating scalded bran. Because Cottonwood Valley was filling with farmers, that was the thing the cattlemen would not look at. Every year since the spur came, more of the bottom land went under the plow, and every man who put a plow in it needed a horse that could pull it, and the little range horses of that country could no more drag a 14-inch breaking plow through unbroken sod than they could read Latin. A farmer with a quarter section needed a team weighing 1,400 pounds apiece. To get such a team he needed a heavy stallion within a day's drive of his mares. There were 2 heavy stallions in Ashford County. One of them belonged to Harlan Deshler and stood at $25 the season. The other one was Gray Tom, and on the 1st day of March, Della Rourke had ridden the 12-mile circuit of the valley and tacked up 9 printed cards on 9 posts, at the crossroads, at the mill, at the ford, at the school, and the 4 corners, printed in Bellamy for $1.50. The gray Percheron Stallion Tom will stand the season of 1885 at the Rourke place on Cottonwood, and Wednesdays at Kittering's mill. $10 the season, $15 to ensure a living colt to stand and suck. Mares kept at pasture 50 cents the week. All care taken, no responsibility for accidents. D. Rourke. 20 days later there was a horseshoe nail in her barn door. She fed out and turned the cows onto the meadow and told Ambrose Peck to keep the stallion in and to keep the barn shut. And then she went in and washed her face and put on the blue dress, because it was the only one that did not have the hem gone, and she saddled the brown mare and rode to Bellamy. Junie rode behind her on the cantle with her arms around her mother's waist, 11 years old and too big for it, because it was Saturday, and because Della had learned in 3 years of widowhood that there were doors a woman went through easier with a child's hand in hers. Bellamy in the spring of 1885 was one street, 40 rods long, with the Stockmen's National Bank at one end in brick and the stockyard pens at the other end at the railhead, and everything worth anything in between. There was Deshler's Mercantile, the biggest building in the county, with plate glass windows freighted in from Omaha. There was the Elkhorn Saloon. There was a livery, a harness shop, a land office. a newspaper called the Ashfork Clarion that came out on Thursdays, the Grange Hall, and Sol Petrie's smithy set well back from the street in a yard of its own, on account of the fire. Della went to the smithy first. Solomon Petrie was 64 years old, built like a barrel with the hoops still on it, and had shod horses in that country since before it had a name on any map. He had a bad left hip from a mule and a habit of talking to a foot while he was working on it. When Della came into the yard, he was cooling a shoe in the slack tub, and the steam came up around his forearms. And he looked at her face and set the tongs down. Somebody nailed something to something, he said. She gave him the order. He read it at arm's length, moving his lips, and when he got to the signature, he made a noise in his throat like a man clearing chaff. Spavin, he said, in the hock. That is what it says. I had that horse's hind feet up in my hands on the 9th of this month. Petrie folded the paper and handed it back. Both of them. I pulled his shoes and cut him back and set him in a plain flat shoe with 4 cocks because you asked me to. And if there had been a spavin the size of a pea on either hock of that horse, it would have come up under my hand when I brought the foot forward, and it would have come up under the hand of any man who has ever done this work for wages. There is no spavin on that horse. There is no curb, no thoroughpin, no bog on him anywhere. He has the cleanest hind leg of any heavy horse in this valley, and I include the black one in that. Aurelius Kemp, Della said. Do you know him? I know of him. Petrie picked the tongs up and then set them down again, which for him amounted to a considerable speech. He passed on horses for a railroad contractor over in Miles City 3 years back. There was talk, there is always talk, but there was more of it about him than about most. He looked at her steadily. Della, who wants that horse off the road? You know who. Say it anyhow. It does a body good to hear it said. Harlan Deshler wants that horse off the road, she said. Because I am standing him at $10, and Deshler is standing his black at $25. And there are 140 farmers in this valley with mares to breed, and every one of them can do sums. Sol Petrie shook his head slowly. No, he said, that is not it, or that is not all of it. Deshler does not care about your $10. Deshler has got himself a syndicate. A what? You have not heard. He almost smiled, and it was not a pleasant thing to look at. Then you had best come to the Grange Hall tonight, because he is selling that black horse. Selling him. To the whole valley at once, Sol Petrie said. $100 a share, 40 shares, $4,000 for one horse. And the papers on him come out of France. The Grange Hall was full by 7, and standing room by 1/2 past. Della Rourke had never in 3 years seen that many farmers in one building in Ashford County. They came in from the bottom in wagons with lanterns hung on the bows, Bohemians and Swedes from the lower valley, a whole family of Kentuckians from the head of Deer Creek, men who had walked 4 miles in the mud with their pant legs tied at the ankle. They came because the handbill had said heavy horses and how a poor man may own one, and because in a country where a good work team costs $300, that was the only sentence that mattered. Harlan Deshler had the platform, and he had it arranged. He was 54 years old, a wide, slow-moving man in a black frock coat with a gold watch chain heavy enough to hobble a calf, and he had come into that country in 1878 with a wagon of dry goods, and now owned the Mercantile, a third of the Stockman's National Bank, 11,000 acres of deeded ground on the West Bench, and the ear of every commissioner in Ashford County. He did not shout. That was the thing Della always noticed about him. He talked to a room of 200 men the way he talked to one man across a counter, and the room leaned in to hear him, and leaning in was the first thing he ever asked anybody to do. On an easel beside him stood a lithograph 3 feet high, in colors, of a coal-black stallion with his neck arched and his tail up. standing on a green sward with a French chateau behind him. "Gentlemen," Deshler said, "I want you to look at that picture, and then I want you to look at the animal himself, because he is in Sherman's livery 2 doors down, and any of you may put your hands on him tonight. And I want you to notice that they are the same horse." There are men in the horse business who could not say that. Laughter, and some of it easy. He gave them the whole thing in 40 minutes. The horse was a Norman Percheron stallion named Vulcan, foaled in 1876 in the district of Le Perche in France, bred by a house called Perrot Frères of Nogent-le-Rotrou, landed at New York on the 14th of October 1879, and recorded in the Percheron Norman Stud Book of America at Chicago under the number 2117. He had the certificate of origin from France, signed by the breeder and countersigned by the mayor of the commune. He had the entry from the stud book. He had a customs receipt. Deshler held them up one at a time, and a hired man walked them down the aisle so that men could hold the papers in their own hands, and Della watched 40 men in a row touch a piece of paper covered in French they could not read, and hand it on with a kind of reverence. The proposition was this. Deshler had paid $4,000 for the horse. He was not asking any man in that room to pay $4,000. He was offering 40 shares at $100 each, and a share entitled the holder to 2 services a year for 10 years, and a vote in the company, and a share of the fees taken from outside mares. A man could pay cash, or he could give 3 notes, $100 total, with interest at 10%, due in the falls of 1886, 1887, and 1888, secured by a chattel mortgage on his own team or his own crop, and the company guaranteed 60% of mares served to be in foal, or the fee returned. "This is how they do it in Illinois," Deshler said. "This is how they do it in Iowa, where they have got farms worth $100 an acre. And they have got them because their horses weigh 1,800 pounds instead of 800. A poor man cannot buy a $4,000 stallion. 40 poor men can. That is the whole of it. That is the entire secret of the thing." Then he said, in exactly the same easy voice, without a change in it anywhere, "Now, there is a woman up Cottonwood who has tacked cards on the posts of this county offering a gray horse at $10, and I am obliged to speak to it, because some of you will have seen the cards, and some of you are thinking that 10 is a smaller number than 25. The room turned. Della felt it turn, the way you feel weather turn. That horse was examined this month by Dr. Aurelius Kemp of Cheyenne, a graduate veterinary surgeon, and condemned by the stock committee as unsound in the hock and unfit for public service, and the order is posted at the courthouse, and any man may read it. I take no pleasure in it. Mrs. Rourke is a widow, and she has had a hard road. But a spavin is in the bone, and it goes down to the get. And a colt got by an unsound horse is a colt you will feed for 4 years and sell for the price of his hide. $10 is not cheap. $10 is the most expensive horse in this valley." She stood up. She had not planned to. Junie's hand came up and caught her sleeve and let go of it. 200 faces came around, and the lamps were behind her. And she heard her own voice come out flatter and harder than she meant it to. "Mr. Deshler, did Dr. Kemp lay a hand on my horse?" Deshler looked at her with a great deal of patience. "The examination was conducted properly, ma'am. That is not what I asked you. My horse has been in my barn or in my sight every day since the 1st of December. No stranger has touched him. No stranger has been on my place. I am asking you in front of these men, and they can weigh it however they please. Did Aurelius Kemp put his hands on the hocks of that horse? Yes or no?" There was a silence of perhaps 3 seconds, which in a full room is a long time. "A veterinary surgeon," Deshler said, "may form an opinion from the way an animal moves." "From how far off?" "Mrs. Rourke, I am going to ask you to sit down, out of respect for the men here who have come to do business." "Sol Petrie shod that horse on the 9th, Della said. "He is sitting right there. He has had both those hocks in his hands, and he is the best farrier between here and Cheyenne, and every man in this room has paid him money to say what is wrong with a horse's leg. Ask him." Every head in the hall went to Sol Petrie. The old man got up off the bench slowly, on account of the hip, and stood with his hat in both hands. "There is nothing on the hocks of the Rourke horse," he said. "Nothing at all. I will say it to anybody, anywhere, under oath if it is wanted." And Della Rourke understood in that moment, standing in a hot room in a blue dress with her chin up, that she had won the argument and lost the room, because Harlan Deshler simply waited and let the silence go on one beat too long, and then said, kindly, "Mr. Petrie has done work for Mrs. Rourke on credit. That is generosity, and I honor him for it. Now, gentlemen, the subscription book is open at this table, and Mr. Case from the bank is here to witness the notes." It took an hour and 20 minutes to sell 31 shares. Della stood at the back and watched them line up. She knew almost every man in the line. She knew Pete Halloran, who had helped Ambrose carry Emmett up from the creek, and who signed for 1 share, and stood a moment afterward, looking at the pen as if it had bitten him. She knew Anton Vasek, who had 5 daughters and 160 acres of the best bottom in the valley, and no team worth the name. She knew the Kentuckians. She watched them put their names to notes at 10% secured by their crops. And she thought, not one of you has $400. Not one of you. And you have just bought 1/10 of a horse apiece. Outside, in the cold, Pete Halloran caught up with her while she was untying the brown mare. "Della," he said, "I want you to know I don't believe it about your horse." "Then why did you sign, Pete?" He looked at the ground, and then he looked at her, and there was no dishonesty in his face at all, only tiredness. "Because if he is telling the truth, I have got a French stallion for $100, he said. "And if he is lying, I have still got to plow 40 acres this spring, and I have got to be on the good side of the man who carries my account at the mercantile, and my wife is due in June. That is why I signed. And I am ashamed of it, and I will still be ashamed of it in the morning, and I signed." He walked away toward his wagon. Junie, who had heard all of it, put her hand into her mother's hand. "Mama, what's a syndicate?" "It is 40 men agreeing to be responsible for something," Della said, "so that no one of them has to be." The cancellations began on Monday. She had 11 mares booked to Grey Tom for the 1885 season, which at $10 was $110, and if half of them insured it was better than $160, and she had counted that money into the October note, the way you count a hand of cards you have not been dealt. On Monday the Kittering boy rode up with a note from his father, saying he reckoned he would wait a year. On Tuesday 2 more. On Wednesday she rode to the mill with the stallion anyway, in the wind, and stood him in the lee of the granary from 9 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, and nobody came. On Thursday the Ashford Clarion printed the stock committee's order in full on the 2nd page, and under it, without comment, the card she had paid $1.50 to have printed, so that the two sat one above the other, and the paper did not have to say a word. By the 1st of April she had 2 mares booked. One belonged to Sol Petrie, and one belonged to a Norwegian named Bergstrom, at the head of the valley, who did not read English and had not heard. She sat at the kitchen table that night with the feed bill and the pencil, and did the arithmetic 3 times. And there was no arrangement of the numbers that got her to $640 in October. Ambrose Peck came in and stood by the stove without taking his hat off, which was how he stood when he had something to say. "I could go over to the Sweetwater," he said. "Shear. There is money in shearing." You are 68 years old. I am 68 years old, and I can still throw a wether. Sit down, Ambrose, she said. Nobody is going anywhere. But she did not sleep that night, and at 2 in the morning she carried the lamp out to the barn, the way she had done since Emmett died, when the arithmetic would not come out, and sat on an upturned bucket in front of the stall and looked at the gray horse in the dark. He came over and put his head down to her, and she put her hand flat on the broad bone of his face and held it there. "What are you," she said to him, "that a man would spend $200 in Cheyenne to keep you off 9 fence posts?" A heavy horse eats 18 pounds of grain and 20 of hay a day when he is working, and rather more when he is standing, and he does not care whose name is on the note at the bank. If he could not earn his keep covering mares, he would earn it another way. So on the 4th of April, Della Rourke put Grey Tom in collar and hames for the first time since Emmett died. Ambrose Peck had the harness down off the pegs and oiled before she finished saying it, because he had been a freighter on the Bozeman Road before he was a hired man, and there was nothing in the world he liked better than a horse big enough to be worth harnessing. They matched the Stallion with a 1,400-pound bay gelding named Judge, which was a mismatch by 4 inches and 300 pounds, and it did not matter in the least, because the gray horse pulled like something poured out of a bucket, smooth and low and even, leaning into the collar without a snatch in him anywhere. The sawmill at the mouth of the canyon paid $2.50 1,000 board feet to haul down to the railhead, and the road came out of the canyon on a grade that had broken 3 wagons that spring. Della drove it herself. She wore Emmett's coat and her own boots, and she sat on the near side of the load with the lines in her left hand and the brake rope in her right, and for 11 weeks that spring she made 3 trips a week and cleared, after feed, something better than $9 a week. It was not $160. It was not the note, but it was money that Harlan Deshler could not vote on. She learned things about the horse in those 11 weeks that she had not known in 5 years of keeping him. She learned that he would not step on a man. She learned that at the bad turn above the second bridge, where the road canted toward the drop and a wagon wanted to run up on the team, he would set himself back into the breeching without being asked and hold the whole load on his hocks, and that he could hold it for as long as it took, and that afterward he would blow twice and shake his head once and go on. She learned that if you spoke to him, he came, and that if you did not speak to him, he watched you until you did. And she learned, one afternoon at the railhead when a stranger from the freight company walked around the team twice and whistled, that men who knew horses looked at Grey Tom differently than men who did not. "Where did you get him?" the freighter asked. "Chicago. 5 years ago. $65. The man laughed once, not believing it, and then looked at her face and stopped laughing. "Ma'am," he said, "I have been buying horses for 18 years, and I have never in my life bought a horse like that for $65, and neither has anybody else." The foals began coming in the 3rd week of April. There is a thing about a heavy horse colt that anyone raised around them knows by the time they are 10 years old. For the first 2 days he is all legs and cannot govern them, and on the 3rd day he stands square, and you can see what he will be. The straightness comes up out of him and shows itself, and a horseman looks down the front of a 3-day-old colt, from the point of the shoulder to the ground the way a carpenter sights down a board. Anton Vasek's mare foaled on the 22nd of April. The colt was black, which pleased Vasek, and heavy-boned, which pleased him more. On the 3rd day the colt stood square, and Vasek stood in the door of his soddy for a long time, without saying anything, and then he went and got his neighbor. The colt was calf-kneed. Both front legs bent backward at the knee, so that standing still he looked as though he were forever about to fold. And behind, the hocks came together and turned under him in the sickle set that no amount of feed or shoeing has ever cured in any horse since horses were kept. By the 15th of May, there were 14 foals on the ground in Cottonwood Valley by the Black Stallion volcano. 9 of them were crooked. 2 of them were so crooked that the men who owned them did not lead them out where people could see. Della heard about it at Petrie's smithy on a Tuesday, and she felt something go cold and settle in her stomach because she had done sums her whole life, and she could do this one. "Soul," she said, "those men are ruined." "Those men," Petrie said, "are ruined, and they have 3 notes apiece coming due, and there is a thing about a ruined man that I have watched for 40 years, and it is this: he does not want the truth. He wants somebody." She said, "It will not be Deshler." "No," said Saltpetre, "it will not be Deshler." The story took 9 days to build, and it was very well built. It came out first in the Elkhorn, from Vince Gorley, who was Deshler's man, and had been since he came up from Texas in 1881, a lean, sandy, soft-spoken man of about 35, who wore his gun where a working hand does not. Gorley told it as a thing he had not wanted to mention. He said that in June of the year before, riding home late along the river road. He had seen a big gray stallion loose on the bottom in the Vasek and Halloran pastures, and that he had thought at the time it was somebody's careless horse, and had not connected it with anything. He said he had seen it twice. He said he was sorry to bring it up now. The story that grew out of that, in 9 days, in a valley of 140 farmers with mares, was this: that the Rourke Gray had been running loose on the bottom in the breeding season of 1884, that he had covered mares that had been booked and paid for, that those mares had thrown crooked foals, that the Gray was condemned for a bone spavin, which everybody knew went down to the get, and that a widow who was short of money had known it and had said nothing. It was a beautiful lie. Della came to admire the construction of it in the way you might admire a well-made trap while your foot is in it. It explained the crooked foals without touching the black horse. It made every ruined man a victim of her instead of a customer of Deshler's. And it required no evidence at all, because the thing it accused her of leaving no record was exactly the thing that left no record. On the last Saturday in May, Harlan Deshler had Vasek's black colt led into the stockyard pens at the railhead at 11 in the morning, when the street was full. Della Rourke was in town that day because it was the day she hauled, and her wagon was standing loaded at the platform with the gray horse in the near side of the team, and there was no possible way to leave. Dr. Aurelius Kemp had come up from Cheyenne again. He was a small, dry, tidy man in a linen duster, with spectacles and a soft voice, and he had a way of speaking to a crowd of farmers as though he were doing arithmetic for children. He had them bring the colt around, and he crouched by it and turned its knee with his hand. "You are looking," he said at heredity. "This colt will never work. This colt will break down in the knee before he is 4. And a defect of this kind does not come out of nowhere. It comes out of a sire. Any man who tells you a crooked leg comes from a mare, or from feed, or from the moon, is either ignorant or has something to sell." Somebody in the crowd said, loudly, "It come out of your horse, Deshler." Kemp straightened up, unhurried, and looked at Deshler. And Deshler looked at the crowd with an expression of very great sadness. "That mare," Deshler said, "was covered by my horse on the 9th of June last year, in Sherman's livery barn with 4 men present, and I would have said it settled the question myself. But Dr. Kemp asked me a question I could not answer. He asked me whether that mare had been anywhere unattended during the season. And she had. She was on Vasek's bottom the whole of last summer, and so were the Halloran mares, and so were 7 others, and I will say no more than that, because the woman it touches is a widow, and I have no wish to be the man who says it out loud." And 200 people looked around, in the sun, in the middle of the street, to where a woman in a blue dress was standing at the head of a gray stallion, hitched to a load of lumber. Della did not look away. That was the only thing she could think to do, and so she did it. And she stood there with her hand on the near rein and let them look. And the moment went on so long that a man at the back began to laugh out of pure nervousness. Then Anton Vesek walked out of the crowd across the open street and stopped 6 feet from her. He was not a young man. He had 5 daughters. He had signed a $100 note in February in a hand he had practiced beforehand so it would look right. "Mrs. Rourke," he said, "I got no team. I got a crooked colt and no team and a note at the bank, and my wheat is in the ground. Mr. Vasek, my wife say you are a good woman." His face was working. "She say, Anton, do not go over there. I got no team, Mrs. Rourke, Mrs. Vasek. That colt is not out of my horse. They say he is loose in my pasture." "Who says?" "One man says. One man who works for Harlan Deshler." She heard her own voice going up and could not stop it. "Mr. Vasek, my stallion has been shut in a barn every night since the day I got him, because he is worth more than everything else I own put together, and if you will come out to my place, I will show you the door and the bar on it, and I will show you the ledger in which I have written down every mare he has covered for 5 years with the date beside it." "A book," Vasek said, "that you write yourself." He turned around and walked back across the street, and the crowd let him through and closed after him. That evening the Ashford Clarion set the type for Thursday's edition. The item ran at the top of the second column under the heading "A Question for the Commissioners," and it was written with great care and did not accuse anyone of anything. And the last sentence of it read, "It is understood that a petition is being prepared by certain farmers of the lower valley, praying the board to order the removal of the animal in question from the county, or such other disposition as the board shall deem fit." Junie Rourke came home from the Cottonwood school on the following Monday with her lunch pail dented and her hair pulled out of its braid. And she would not say who had done it, and she did not cry until after her mother had gone out to milk. Della stood in the dark of the cowshed, with her forehead against the cow's flank, and listened to her daughter cry through 2 walls, and she made a decision there that she did not tell anybody about for 4 months. She was not going to sell that horse. She was not going to gelt him, and she was not going to ship him out of the county in the night. She was going to find out what he was. The petition came before the Board of Commissioners of Ashford County on the 11th of June, 1885, in the second-floor courtroom of the courthouse at Bellamy, with the windows open and the flies coming in and 40-odd men standing along the back wall. Della Rourke had a lawyer, which surprised everybody, including the lawyer. Ellis Mowbray was 27 years old, out of Ann Arbor by way of a failed newspaper in Nebraska, and he had been in Bellamy 9 months and had handled 2 probates and a fence dispute. He took the case for $11, which was what Della had, and because, as he said, he had come west to practice law, and so far had mostly practiced sitting down, he was better than $11. He let Dr. Aurelius Kemp give his whole opinion on the transmission of Bonespaven without interrupting him once. He let Vince Gorley tell the story of the gray horse on the river road twice, and asked him only what time of night it had been, and whether there had been a moon. And Gorley said about 10 o'clock, and yes, there had been. Then Mowbray produced an almanac from the office of the Ashford Clarion, and established that on the 9th and the 21st of June, 1884, the nights Gorley had named, the moon had set before 9 in the evening on the 1st, and had been 3 days new on the 2nd, and asked him to describe how a man tells a gray horse from a light bay at 40 rods in the dark. Gorley said he knew a gray horse when he saw one. "In the dark," Mowbray said. "Grays show up in the dark." "So they do," Mowbray said. "So does a white-faced sorrel, and so does a light dun, and so does a paint." "Mr. Gorley, how many gray horses over 16 hands are there in this valley?" "1. How many were there in June of last year, when Mr. Sherman's livery kept a gray freight team of 4? hired out by the day to anybody with $1. It went on like that for an hour and a half, and by the end of it, Ellis Mowbray had made Vince Gourley look like a man reciting something, which is what he was. Then Mowbray put saltpetre on, and Petrie brought his shoeing book, a greasy ledger in which he had written every horse he had touched since 1876, with the date and the owner and the work done and the money paid, and he read out the entries for Grey Tom for the whole of 1884, and there were 19 of them. And then Mowbray, who was young, did the thing young lawyers do, which was to reach for the end of it too soon. "Gentlemen," he said, "the board has heard a certificate from a veterinary surgeon who admits under my questioning that he examined this animal from a distance of not less than 60 feet, from a road, without permission, and did not enter the property. The board has heard a witness who saw a gray horse on 2 moonless nights a year ago. There is no evidence before you. And I would remind the board that it has, in any event, no authority in the statutes of this territory to order the destruction, removal, or alteration of any man's private property upon a petition of his neighbors. And if the board makes such an order, I will have it before a judge in Cheyenne inside of a month." He was correct. That was the trouble. The chairman of the board was a rancher named Pilcher, who owned 40,000 acres and had never in his life been in a room where Harlan Deshler wanted something and did not get it. He conferred with the county attorney for 4 minutes. Then he announced that the board found itself without power to grant the prayer of the petition, that it therefore declined to make any order, but that it wished to record its opinion, as a body concerned for the improvement of stock in Ashford County, that the gray stallion known as Tom ought not to be used for public service, and to commend the said opinion to the good sense of the people of the county. Ellis Mowbray had won. Della Rourke walked out of that courthouse into the June sunlight having won, and Harlan Deshler was standing at the bottom of the steps talking to 2 men about hay, and he tipped his hat to her as she went by, and she understood before she reached the bottom step exactly what had happened. He had never wanted an order. An order could be appealed, an opinion could not. The letter from the Stockmen's National Bank came on the 23rd of June. It was signed by Fielding Case, cashier, and it was 2 paragraphs long, and it informed Mrs. D. Rourke that the bank, having reviewed the security behind her note of October 1880 as renewed, and deeming itself insecure within the meaning of the clause therein, elected to declare the whole of the principal and interest due and payable on the 1st day of October 1885 in the sum of $2,218.40, not $640, all of it. She read it standing in the mercantile doorway where the clerk had handed it to her, and she read it again on the street, and the second time her hands were steady, which she noted with a kind of distant interest. Deshler was at the back of the store by the coffee mill, and he came up the aisle to her, and he was, as always, entirely pleasant. "I heard about the letter," he said. "I want you to know I was not in the room for that vote. You are on that board, Mrs. Deshler. I am one of 5. He looked at her with what a person who did not know him would have taken for sympathy, and possibly it was. That was the thing about the man that Della never resolved. "Mrs. Rourke, I am going to say a plain thing, and you may take it however you please. I will buy that horse. $500, cash, today, and I will speak to Case about the note, and I believe I can get you back to the annual payment. You would be free of the whole business by supper. And what would you do with him? That would be my affair. You would geld him," she said, "or you would ship him east, or you would shoot him in a coulee. And the reason you would do any of those things is the reason I cannot sell him to you. Because you are attached to him. Because I have got the only thing you are afraid of," Della Rourke said, "and I do not yet know what it is." She saw it then. It was the only time in 18 months that she ever saw it, and it lasted less than a second, something behind Harlan Deshler's face going still. The way the surface of water goes still just before it moves. $500, he said, is more than that animal will ever be worth to you. Then you are a poor businessman, Mr. Deshler, and everybody in this valley says otherwise. Her account at the mercantile was closed on the 28th of June. It was the only store in Ashford County that carried flour, coffee, coal oil, nails, wire, and axle grease. The next nearest was in Cheyenne, 206 miles. They came on the night of the 2nd of July. Ambrose Peck heard the dogs first, at somewhere past 1 in the morning, and he came out of the bunk in the harness room in his underdrawers with the 10-gauge, and by then the barn's back hasp was off. The hasp had been unscrewed rather than broken, which was the detail that stayed with Della afterward, because it meant somebody had stood in the dark for 10 minutes being careful. There were 3 of them. There was a rope on the stallion's head, and they had him halfway to the corral gate when Ambrose came around the corner of the barn and fired the 10-gauge into the air. What happened after that took perhaps 40 seconds, and neither Ambrose nor Della ever got it entirely straight. The horse came up and back at the shot. A man swore. The rope was let go or torn loose, and the gray stallion went through the gap between the barn and the hay corral at a dead run in the dark, with a lead rope whipping behind him, and hit the 3-wire fence of the horse pasture at the corner, where the wire was strung tight between 2 set posts, and went through it, and was gone into the flat. They found him at first light, standing in the creek, with the water up over his knees. There was a rope burn across the crest of his neck under the mane, from the pole halfway to the withers, where the rope had been snubbed and had run. There was a long, shallow tear on the point of the near shoulder, and another across the chest from the wire, and both of his front cannons were skinned. He was stiff. He was sore all through, and he had walked himself into cold running water, and had stood there for 4 hours, which is what a horse of sense does when he can. Della got him out and up to the barn, and Ambrose put on the poultices, and she rode to Bellamy and got Sol Petrie, and Sol brought Dr. Marius Fenn, who was a veterinary surgeon out of Iowa, 31 years old, who had come to Ashford County in April to buy land, and had ended up doctoring horses because there was nobody else within a day's ride who could. Fenn worked on him for 3 hours. Nothing was broken. Nothing was torn that would not close. The wire cuts were shallow because a 1,900-pound horse going through a 3-wire fence at a run takes the whole fence with him and does not stop long enough to be held by it, and the posts had come out. It was the neck that was the trouble. "That is a rope gall on the crest," Fenn said, "and it is going to swell, and the mane is going to lie in it. And if it stays wet under all that hair, you will have a running sore the size of my hand by August, and it will be 6 months healing. That mane has got to come off. Clip it to the crest, the whole length of it, so I can get at that skin and keep it dry." Della Rourke stood in the aisle of her barn with her sleeves rolled and her hands raw with carbolic and said, "No." Both men looked at her. She could not have explained it to a jury. Emmett had loved that mane. Emmett had stood in that same aisle in the fall of 1879, with the horse just off the cars, thin as a rail and coughing, and had lifted a double handful of that black mane and let it fall and said, in the voice of a man who has spent $65 he did not have, "Well, Dell, we bought a horse, and we got a horsehair sofa thrown in. It was one of 11 things she still had of him. There were the boots, there was the watch, there was a way he said her name, and there was that mane. Give it a week," she said. "Let me poultice it a week." Marius Fenn was a young man and a stranger, and had already learned something about the widow Rourke in 3 hours, so he did not argue. "A week," he said. "But if the crest is hot on Tuesday, ma'am, we clip it, and we do not discuss it further." On Tuesday the crest was hot. On Tuesday the crest was hot and swollen along its whole length so that the mane stood up off it, and Marius Fenn came out from Bellamy at 7 in the morning with a pair of sheep shears and a pair of curved scissors, and did not say anything at all about the week. Della held the horse herself. Ambrose Peck stood at the near shoulder with the twitch in his hand and never had to use it. Fenn started at the withers and worked forward, taking the mane off in slabs, and the black hair came away in his fist a double handful at a time, and he dropped it into a feed sack because Della had asked him to, and there was no sound in the barn for a quarter of an hour except the shears and the horse breathing. It took longer than it should have. The mane was 15 years of nothing ever cutting it, and it was matted at the roots along the crest where the swelling was, and Fenn had to go slowly there and take it in small bites with the scissors, working from the off side, with the horse's head pulled around and down against Della's chest. He was 2/3 of the way along the near side of the crest when he stopped. He did not say anything. He put the scissors down on the top of the stall wall, and he took a handful of the cut hair away and rubbed at the skin with his thumb, hard, the way you rub a coin, and then he stood back. "Mrs. Rourke," he said, "bring the lantern around here." The rope gall was an angry pink line above it. Below the gall, on the near side of the neck a hand's breadth, under the roots of the mane, where 15 inches of black hair had lain over it every day of that horse's life, the gray hide carried a mark. It was a brand. It had been put on with iron, and it had been put on well, by somebody who knew how, and it had healed white, and slightly raised. And the hair had grown back over it white and thin, so that in a 15-year mane, on a gray horse, it had not been visible from any angle at any distance to any person on earth. It was a diamond, about 2.5 inches across, standing on its point. Inside the diamond were 2 letters, P and F. Under the diamond, in figures half the size, was a number. The number was 41. Nobody said anything for a while. The horse shifted his weight and swung his head against Della's shoulder, wanting to be let go. "That is not an American brand," Marius Fenn said at last. "How do you know?" "Because I am from Cedar County, Iowa, ma'am, and my father's neighbor bought 2 Norman stallions out of Chicago in 1878. And both of them carried a mark like that on the near side of the neck under the mane, put on by the exporting house in France before shipment, so that horses could not be exchanged between the boat and the buyer." There was a great deal of exchanging. He looked at her. "That is a French house brand. That is a shipped horse. Mrs. Rourke, whatever else is true, your husband did not buy a grade plow horse. Somebody in France put that iron on that neck, and somebody in France wrote the number 41 in a book beside a name." Della Rourke stood with her hand flat on the gray horse's face and did not move for a long moment. Then she said, "Sol, get down off the wall and come look at this." Sol Petrie had been sitting on the top rail of the stall the whole morning with his bad hip stuck out, and he got down and came and looked and put his thumb on the mark the way Fenn had, and rubbed and stood there with his hat pushed back. "Well," he said. "Well, now say it, Sol. There is one man in Ashford County," Sol Petrie said slowly, "that ever imported a horse out of France. One. And he has spent $200 in Cheyenne, and a summer's worth of talk, and 3 men in your barn at 1 o'clock in the morning to keep anybody from looking close at this animal, and there was only ever one thing on this animal to look at, and it was under 15 inches of horsehair, and he could not get at it, and neither could anybody else, until his own man put a rope on this horse's neck and burned the hair off." He turned around and looked at Della. "Girl," he said, "your horse has got papers somewhere." They wrote 4 letters that week. Ellis Mowbray drafted them at his desk over the land office with his coat off, and he took considerable care over them, because, as he pointed out, They were going to be read by strangers 2,000 miles away who had no reason on earth to answer a widow in Wyoming Territory. And the difference between an answer and no answer was whether the letter made the reader curious. The first went to the secretary of the Percheron Norman Stud Book of America at Chicago, asking for the recorded description, color, markings, date of importation, and importer of the Stallion Vulcan, number 2117. The second went to the collector of customs at the Port of New York, asking for the entry of imported horses landed from the steamer Amariki on or about the 14th of October, 1879, with the names of the consignees. The third went to Ballard and Roan, commission merchants, Union Stockyards, Chicago, whose printed heading appeared on the bill of sale for one gray stallion horse, grade $65, dated the 9th of November, 1879, and signed by a clerk, which Della had found in the bottom of Emmett's Japan tin box under the tax receipts, folded in with a lock of Junie's baby hair. The fourth went to Perrot Frere, Nogent-le-Rotrou, Département d'Eure-et-Loire, France, and it was the one Mowbray took the most trouble over, and it asked one question. To what animal, in the books of that house, did the shipping brand numbered 41 belong? Della carried all four to town on the 14th of July and mailed them at the post office. And the post office in Bellamy was a set of pigeonholes and a scale behind a wicket at the back of Deshler's mercantile, because that is how it was in 100 towns in that territory, and the postmaster was a clerk who drew $11 a month from the government and $35 from Harlan Deshler. She realized it on the road home, about 4 miles out, and reined the brown mare up in the middle of the track and sat there. She turned around and went back and asked for her letters, and the clerk said with real regret that the mail sack had gone down on the noon train, and she said that was all right, and rode home, and did not sleep. Only one of the four was ever answered. After that, she used the railhead. There was an express messenger on the through freight who would take a letter for a quarter and put it in the company's own pouch at Cheyenne, and he was a Scotsman named Galt, with a low opinion of postmasters generally. And from the 20th of July onward, every letter that Della Rourke wrote and every letter that came back to her went into or came out of the hand of a man on a moving train. That was in July. The answers were not going to come before September, and one of them would have to cross an ocean twice, and in the meantime there was a note for $2,218.40 falling due on the 1st of October, and there was hay to put up. They put up 91 tons that summer, Della and Ambrose Peck and Junie Rourke. And one hired Bohemian boy named Carroll, who worked for $4 a week and his board, and who was the only person in the lower valley who would work for her. Grey Tom mowed. He was too big for the mower, and the seat was too far back, and Ambrose had to build up the shafts, and he mowed 60 acres of wild hay in the July heat with the horseflies on him. And every morning Della washed the crest of his neck with carbolic and looked at the brand. She looked at it the way you look at a word in a foreign language that you are certain you will understand tomorrow. On the 6th of August, Harlan Deshler drove out to the Rourke place in a buggy, alone, which he had never done, and sat in the yard without getting down. $1,200, he said. Della had a pitchfork in her hands. She did not put it down. You have gone from 500 to 1,200 in 6 weeks, Mr. Deshler. The market moves. There is no market. There is you. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. I will ask you something, and you may lie to me. It costs me nothing. What is the number 41? She had not planned to say it. She said it because she had been carrying it for 11 days, and because there was nobody in the world to say it to, and she watched it land. Harlan Deshler's face did not change at all, and his hands did not move on the lines, and he looked at her for about 4 seconds. Then he said, 1,500. and your note carried to 1890 at 6%, and your account open at the store from today. And I will put it all in writing in front of a judge if you want it." "Mr. Deshler," Della said, "in March you had a veterinary surgeon condemn a horse you had never seen for $100. In August you are offering me $1,500 for the same horse. I am a slow woman, but I am not that slow." "Mrs. Rourke," he picked up the lines, "I am going to say something to you as a man who is 60% of the credit in this valley, and you may take it as a threat if it comforts you, but it is not one. It is a description. You are going to lose this ranch on the 1st of October. Not because of me. Because you have 48 cows and a mortgage written in a good year. I am offering you a way to walk off it with $1,500 and your name good, and a girl of 11 who will not have to be raised in a rented room in Cheyenne. That is the whole of what is on the table, and it will not be on the table in October." "Then I will see you in October," said Della Rourke. He turned the buggy in the yard. At the gate he stopped it and looked back at the barn, where a gray horse had his head out over the half door, watching the buggy the way he watched everything. "That is a good horse," Harlan Deshler said, and there was something in his voice that Della thought about for a year afterward, because it was not calculation and it was not malice. It was a man looking at something he had thrown away in 1879 and had been paying for ever since. Then he drove out. The first letter came back on the 19th of August, out of the hand of the Scotsman Galt on the through freight, and it was from Chicago, and it was 3 lines from the secretary of the Percheron Norman Stud Book of America, and it said this: "Vulcan, no, 2117. Recorded Tuku, December 1879, upon application of H. Deshler, Agent Fold 1876, France, color, black, small star. Imported per steamer Amérique, October 1879. Now the property of the Cottonwood Valley Norman Horse Company, Bellamy, Wyoming Territory." Della read it standing on the platform at the railhead with the freight pulling out behind her, and she read it 4 times. And each time the same words stood up off the paper and hit her. Black, the book in Chicago said the horse from France was black. Harlan Deshler's Stallion was black. Every paper the man had waved over his head in the Grange Hall in February was, so far as any office in America knew, perfectly and completely true. And a gray horse in her barn had a French iron on his neck. She sat down on a baggage truck on the platform at Bellamy in the middle of the afternoon and put the letter in her lap and understood, at last, all at once, the whole shape of the thing, the way you understand a room when the lightning goes. Nobody had stolen a horse. Somebody had stolen a name. Ellis Mowbray laid it out on his desk that evening with 4 objects on it: the bill of sale from Ballard and Roan, the letter from Chicago, the stock committee's order with the horseshoe nail hole through the top of it, and a sheet of foolscap on which he had drawn 2 horses. "Badly, say it slowly," he said, "and I will try to break it." In the fall of 1879, Della said Harlan Deshler was an agent buying horses in Chicago, and he brought 1 horse over from France, a gray. He is branded 41 by the house that shipped him, and he is entered somewhere in France under a name and a number, and I would give my teeth to know what they are. Go on. Something happened to that horse between the boat and the buyer. He got sick, or he got hurt, or he came off the cars looking like 40 cents. And Deshler had somebody waiting to be sold a French stallion, and a horse that looks like a scarecrow does not sell for $4,000 whatever the papers say. So he bought a big showy black in Chicago, out of a dealer's barn, cheap and unrecorded and nothing behind him. And he gave the black the French horse's papers. How does a man do that? He does it in December, Della said, with a pen, on an application to a stud book in Chicago, in his own hand, with nobody within 2,000 miles who has ever laid eyes on either horse. He writes color black small star because that is the horse he is standing in the barn. And then he sells the sick gray to the first fool who will take him off his hands, and my husband was in the yards with 2 carloads of steers, and my husband was the fool." Mowbray turned the foolscap around and looked at his 2 bad drawings. "There is a hole in it," he said. "It works too well. If it were only a swindle on one buyer in 1879, it was done and finished 6 years ago and forgotten. Why does a man in Wyoming Territory spend $200, his reputation with the Board of Commissioners, and 3 men in a barn at 1 in the morning over something finished 6 years ago? Because it was not finished." Della put her hand on the letter from Chicago. "Read the last line. 'Now the property of the Cottonwood Valley Norman Horse Company, Bellamy, Wyoming Territory.'" "He never sold the black," she said. The buyer fell through, or the deal soured, and Harlan Deshler was left holding a $100 horse with $4,000 of French paper hung on him, and he did the only thing a man like that ever does. He waited 6 years, and he came out to a country where nobody had ever seen a Norman horse, and he sold that same paper to 40 farmers, $100 at a time. And it was perfect, Miss Mowbray. It was airtight. Every document he owns is genuine. There is only one thing in the world that can touch him, and it is a horse he sold for $65 in 1879 that he thought he would never see again, standing at a mill on Wednesdays for $10 a mare 12 miles from his store. Ellis Mowbray sat back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Rourke," he said, "if this is true, then in February of last year in the Grange Hall, that man committed a fraud on 40 of his neighbors in the amount of $4,000, and every note they signed is void, and the crooked-legged colts in this valley are the direct issue of his own scrub stallion." "Yes, and to prove any of it, we require a document that is presently in France." "Yes, and what we have got until it comes," Mowbray said, "is a brand under a mane, and the word of a widow the whole county has been taught to distrust. And a note for $2,218 falling due in 6 weeks, Della said. Do not leave that out. She paid $791 on the 1st of October, 1885. She got it by selling 26 head of cattle at a price that made Ambrose Peck walk out of the pens and stand behind the loading chute with his hat off. She got it out of 11 weeks of lumber hauling. She got $110 of it from Ambrose Peck himself, who had it in a canvas sack under the floor of the harness room and had not touched it since 1877, and who put it on the kitchen table and would not discuss the matter, and 40 of it from Sol Petrie, and $32.50 from Ellis Mowbray, who did not have it either. Fielding Case counted it at the wicket and pushed most of it back. The bank, he said, has elected to call the whole. A part payment is not a payment. I am sorry, Mrs. Rourke. Mowbray filed his bill in the district court at Cheyenne on the 9th of October. It said that the acceleration of the note under the insecurity clause had been made in bad faith and at the instance of a director of the bank who had a private interest adverse to the borrower, and it asked that the sale be restrained until the truth of the matter could be heard. It was, as Mowbray said, a thin bill, and it would probably not win. It did not have to win. It had to be heard, and the district court at Cheyenne was 4 months behind, and Judge Alonzo Sharp continued the matter to the May term of 1886 and restrained the sale in the meantime, because a judge who has 400 cases will always rather continue one than decide it. Harlan Deshler had bought the county. He had not bought Cheyenne. That was the first thing that had gone Della Rourke's way in 7 months, and it bought her a winter. The boiler came up on the cars on the 3rd of November. The Bellamy Milling Company had contracted for a new roller mill, and the heart of it was a horizontal boiler weighing 11,400 pounds freighted from Milwaukee. and it had to go from the railhead at the end of the street to the mill site 1.25 miles up the creek grade, on a set of heavy log trucks with wheels a foot wide, over ground that had frozen and thawed twice. The contractor was a man named Rundle out of Laramie, who had moved boilers before. He had 6 mules and 2 teamsters, and he was hired to put it up the grade in 1 day. And by noon of the first day he had moved it 40 rods and broken a 5th chain, and was standing in the road swearing in a way that people came out of the harness shop to admire. The trouble with a dead weight is not the hauling of it. The trouble is the start. 11,000 pounds on frozen ruts does not roll until it is persuaded. And to persuade it, you want horses strung out ahead in a string, and you want every one of them to lie into the collar at the same instant and stay there and lean, and you want them to keep leaning after it has hurt for a while. Any horse in the string that lunges and quits takes the whole start out of it, because the load has moved 4 inches and stopped, and the next attempt begins from a hole. By 2 o'clock half the town was on the street. Harlan Deshler put his black in at 3. It was, Della admitted, a beautiful thing to look at coming down the street. Vulcan, $4,000, 17 hands and coal black, with his mane braided up in the French way with straw ribbon, led by Vince Gorley in his good coat, and men took their hats off, actually took their hats off, as he went by. They put him in the lead with a mate. Rundle's teamster called for the start. The black horse threw himself into the collar and got the load moving 8 inches, and then came up in the air, and came down, and threw himself again, and quit. 3 times. On the third, the whole string went slack, and one of the mules went down on a knee, and the load rolled back into its own hole, with a sound like a barn door closing. "He is not broke to it," Deshler said, out loud, easily to the street. "He is a breeding horse, and he has never been in a heavy hitch in his life. Take him out." That was true, and it was the correct thing to say, and it was even a graceful thing to say, and it did not matter one damn. Because 200 people had just watched a $4,000 horse quit. There was a silence on the street. Then Saul Petrie said, from the door of his shop, loud enough to carry the whole length of Bellamy, "Rundle, send up to the Rourke place." Ambrose Peck brought the gray horse down at 4 o'clock with a work collar on him and no ribbon in anything, and Della Rourke walked at his head in the blue dress and a canvas coat with her sleeves rolled to the elbow. Rundle looked at her and then at the horse and then at the sky, which was going the color of a nickel. "Ma'am, can he lead a string?" "He can lead a string. There is 9 tons on those trucks and 1.25 miles of grade, and I have got 2 hours of light." "Then hitch him," Della said. They put Gray Tom in the lead alone, with the bay gelding judge behind him and the 6 mules behind that, and Rundle's teamster in the middle with the long line, and Ambrose at the wheel team, and Della Rourke walked at the gray horse's head with her hand under the cheek of the bit. She did not shout at him. Nobody who saw it ever reported that she raised her voice at all. She stood beside his head and put her hand flat on the broad bone of his face for a moment, the way she had done 10,000 times in the barn in the dark, and then she stepped back to his shoulder and said, "All right, Tom." And 1,900 pounds of gray horse leaned into a leather collar and did not come up out of it. He did not lunge. He set his hind legs under him and put his nose almost to the ground and put his whole weight forward into the collar in one long steady press, and he held it, and the chain came up out of the frozen mud and rang tight, and behind him the bay took hold, and behind the bay the mules felt the load already moving and took hold, and the whole string came into it together in a wave from the front to the back, and 11,400 pounds of Milwaukee iron broke out of the ruts and rolled. Somebody yelled. Then everybody did. It took 2 hours and 10 minutes to put it up the grade, and there were 4 more starts on the way, and he made every one of them. And at the steepest pitch above the second bend, he held the whole load on the grade for the count of 30, while a teamster reset a chain, standing in the collar with his hind legs shaking, and the steam coming off his back in the cold, and Della Rourke stood at his head, with her hand on his face, and her forehead against his jaw, and talked to him the entire time in a voice nobody else could hear. They put the boiler on the mill sill at 10 minutes past 6 in the dark by lantern light, and the crowd that came up the grade behind them was 200 people, and when the chains came slack, Rundle the contractor walked the length of that string in front of everybody and stood at the gray horse's head and took his hat off. "Ma'am," he said, "I have moved boilers in 3 territories. What is that horse?" Della Rourke stood in the lantern light with her hand on the neck of a stallion the county had condemned in March, 1 inch above a French brand nobody had seen in 6 years, and gave the only honest answer she had. "That," she said, "is exactly what I am trying to find out." The winter of 1885 and 1886 was long, and it was cold, and it was the season in which Della Rourke learned what a man does when he begins to be afraid. The boiler had cost Harlan Deshler something, not money, in a country where every man's living depended on what his horses could pull. 200 people had stood in a frozen street and watched a $4,000 stallion come out of the collar 3 times, and then watched a widow's condemned gray take the same load out of the same hole without lifting his feet, and no speech in a Grange hall was ever going to unmake it. Men who had crossed the street to avoid her in June began nodding to her in November. The Bohemian boy Carell was joined by his cousin. Somebody left a quarter of beef hanging in her spring house at Christmas and never said who. Deshler moved in December, and he moved intelligently, which was the only way he ever moved. He offered every shareholder in the Cottonwood Valley Norman Horse Company a release. The terms were these: any subscriber who surrendered his share certificate and signed a paper acknowledging that he had received full value and had no claim of any kind against the company or against Harlan Deshler personally would have his 3 notes returned to him marked paid. $100 of debt wiped out for a signature. For a farmer with a crooked colt in the corral and a note at 10%, it was rain in a dry year. Ellis Mowbray understood what it was inside of a minute. "He is buying the witnesses," he said. "Every man who signs that release is a man who cannot testify to a fraud he has sworn in writing was not committed. He is not settling with them. He is emptying the courtroom." 19 men signed in the first week. Della did not blame a single one of them, and said so out loud in the smithy, which was the nearest thing that Valley had to a newspaper that told the truth. Anton Vasic signed. He came out to the Rourke place afterward and stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and said he was sorry, and she said, "Miss Vasic, you have got 5 daughters. Sign anything he puts in front of you." And he cried, which neither of them ever mentioned again. 11 men did not sign. Pete Halloran was one of them, and the reason was his wife. Ruth Halloran was 39 years old, had buried 3 children and raised 4, and had a memory like a court reporter. She came to the Rourke kitchen in January through 11 inches of snow in a wagon she drove herself, and she sat down at the table and put her hands flat on it. "Mrs. Rourke," she said, "I want to tell you about my Mare, and I want you to have Mr. Mowbray write it down, and I will swear to it in front of anybody in this territory." Her mare was a brown mare of 1,300 pounds called Peg. In June of 1884, Peg had been bred to the black stallion Vilcane in Sherman's livery barn in Bellamy. On the 11th, with Pete Halloran and Vince Gorley, and Sherman's hired man present, and the fee had been paid in cash and entered in the company's book. And Peg had never in her life been on Vasek's bottom. nor anywhere else. She had a foal at foot that summer and a fenced 2-acre lot behind the Halloran house, with the house on one side and the road on the other, and the Hallorans in and out of it 40 times a day. She had not been out of that lot from the 12th of June 1884 until the snow came, and she foaled the 4th of May last, Ruth Halloran said. A brown horse colt. And he stands like this. She got up from the table and stood with her knees pressed together, and her feet apart, and her hands turned back at the wrists, and it was such an exact imitation of a calf-kneed sickle-hocked colt that Junie Rourke laughed out loud before she could stop herself, and then put both hands over her mouth in horror. "Laugh, child," said Ruth Halloran. "It is either laugh or take an axe to a man." She sat back down. There it is, Mrs. Rourke, one mare, in a lot, in a town, in front of witnesses, covered by his horse, and no other horse living. And a crooked colt. If your gray got to my peg, he came through a picket fence and past a house with a lamp in it and my husband's dogs, and he did it in the daylight in the middle of Bellamy. And there is not one man in this valley who will believe that once it is put to him plain. Ellis Mowbray took her affidavit on the 14th of January, 1886, and Della Rourke rode home that night thinking that she had it, and that spring would settle everything. Spring settled nothing. The May term of the district court at Cheyenne opened on the 11th, and the bill to restrain the sheriff's sale was called on the 19th. And Judge Alonzo Sharp listened to Ellis Mowbray for 50 minutes and to the bank's attorney for 12, and dissolved the injunction. The insecurity clause, he said, meant what it said. A bank that believed itself insecure might call the note. Whether the belief arose from the state of the cattle market or from the private malice of a director was a question the court would entertain in a proper action for damages, tried in its turn, in about, the judge estimated, 2 years. The sale would proceed. The sheriff of Ashford County advertised the Rourke place for sale on the courthouse steps at Bellamy on the 9th of July, 1886. In the Ashford Clarion, 3 weeks running, in 6-point type at the bottom of the 4th page. Della read it at the kitchen table with the lamp turned down to save oil. 480 acres. The hay meadow. The barn Emmett built too big. The windmill that ran 2 days out of 3. Under the law of the territory, she would have 6 months after the sale in which to redeem it by paying the whole judgment, and she did not have to be a lawyer to know what that was worth to a woman with 5 cows. Junie came and stood beside her chair. "Are we going to lose it?" Della Rourke had told her daughter the truth about everything for 3 years, on principle, because she had decided in the cowshed in May of 1885 that a girl who was going to be lied to by an entire county had better have one person who did not. "Yes," she said, "on the 9th of July, unless something comes in the mail." From France. From France. How long does it take a letter to come from France? 6 weeks, if it comes at all, if it was ever answered. If the house is still in business, and if some clerk 2,000 miles from here cared enough about a woman he never heard of to go down in a cellar and open a book from 1879. Junie thought about that. "Mama," she said, "how big is the sea?" The letters came out of Chicago and New York that winter and spring, one at a time, out of the hand of a Scotsman on a moving train. And each one was worth something, and not one of them was enough. Ballard and Roan, commission merchants, replied in November. Their daybook for the 9th of November, 1879, showed received of H. Deshler, agent, 1 Stallion horse, gray, French, in poor order, sold same day. E. Rourke, $65, cash. It proved that Deshler had sold Emmett the gray. It did not prove which horse's papers the gray owned. The collector of customs at the port of New York replied in February, over the signature of a deputy, with an extract of the entry for the steamer Amérique, arrived the 14th of October 1879. Horses, 1 entire, gray, 4 years, France, Consignee H. Deshler, 1, gray. That is very good, Ellis Mowbray said. That is the best thing we have got. And I will tell you exactly what he will say to it, because I would say it myself if I were his lawyer. He will say the clerk wrote gray, because the clerk saw a gray horse on the boat, and there were 200 horses on that boat. He will say the entry is another man's animal. He will say a customs clerk in New York cannot identify a horse in Wyoming Territory 6 years later. And a jury will look at a piece of paper with 1 word on it, and they will look at Harlan Deshler, and they will not know. Then what closes it? 2 things, Mowbray said. A document out of France that ties the number burned on that horse's neck to a name, a color, and a date, and a witness who will stand in a courtroom and say, "That iron is my house's iron, and I put it on, and here is the man who signed for the horse." On the 29th of June, 1886, 10 days before the sheriff's sale, Della Rourke rode to the railhead at Bellamy to meet the through freight, as she had done twice a week for 11 months. Galt came down out of the express car with a canvas pouch, and he was grinning, which he had never done. "Missus," he said, "you've a foreign one." It was a heavy envelope, water-stained at one corner, addressed in a slanting continental hand, and it had come from Nogent-le-Rotrou, Eure-et-Loire, by way of Le Havre and New York and Omaha, and it had been 11 weeks on the road. She did not open it at the railhead. She rode the 6 miles home with it inside her dress against her ribs, and put it on the kitchen table, and sent Carol for Sol Petrie and for Mowbray. And when the 2 of them were sitting down, and Ambrose Peck was standing by the stove with his hat on, she took the butter knife and slit it. There were 4 things in it. There was a letter in English, 3 pages, from Etienne Robichaud, of Chicago, agent in the United States for the house of Percheron, who wrote that Mrs. Rourke's inquiry had been forwarded to Nogent-le-Rotrou in April and had caused, he said, a considerable stir. There was a certified extract from the shipping book of the house for the campaign of 1879, in French, with a translation attached in Robichaud's hand, and it read, "No, 41. Vulcan Percheron Stallion, foaled 1876 at the farm of Soants, by Sultan out of Fanchette. Coat, gris pommely, dapple gray. Marks a small star, whorl on the near side of the neck. Branded no. 41 within the house lozenge, near side of neck, 9 September 1879. Shipped from Le Havre 30 September 1879 per steamer Amérique. Delivered New York 14 October 1879 to the agent H. Deshler, receipt signed." There was the receipt itself, or a certified copy of it, with the signature at the bottom, H. Deshler, agent, 14 Oct. 1879, and Della had seen that signature on 11 years of accounts at the mercantile, and would have known it upside down in a mirror. And there was a certified copy of the certificate d'origine, made out at the Mare of the commune of Soants, signed by the breeder and countersigned by the Mare and stamped, which described the horse Vulcan, foaled 1876, in a single French adjective repeated twice, in the body of the document and in the margin, gris. Gray. Gray Robichaud's letter said one thing more, and it was the thing that made Ellis Mowbray get up out of his chair and walk to the window and stand there with his back to the room. The house of Percheron, wrote Robichaud, has since 1881 been aware that the stallion Vulcan is entered in the American register as a black horse. The house wrote twice to Chicago upon the point and received no satisfaction. The house has for 5 years borne the reputation of having shipped a horse that did not answer his papers. And there is no injury you can do a breeding establishment in France that is worse than that one. I am instructed to say that if this matter comes before any court or committee in the United States, I will attend it at the expense of my house, and I will bring the books." Sol Petrie broke the silence. "Read me the color one more time," he said. "Gris pomely," said Della Rourke. "Dapple gray." The old man put both hands on the table and pushed himself up and stood there a moment. "6 years," he said. "That horse has been standing in a barn 6 miles from that man's store for 6 years, with the answer burnt on his neck, and every single soul in this county looked at him and saw a plow horse." The 4th of July celebration at Bellamy in 1886 began at 10 in the morning with a procession, and had a Bowery dance, a baseball game against the Chugwater Nine, a greased pole, an address by the county attorney on the blessings of the Republic, and, at 2 o'clock, an exhibition of stock in the street between the bank and the stockyard pens. Harlan Deshler brought the black stallion out at 2, groomed to a shine, mane braided, led by Vince Gorley, and walked him up and down the street twice, while a man from the Clarion took notes. At 20 minutes past 2, Della Rourke came into the top of the street from the direction of the ford, on foot, in the blue dress, leading Grey Tom in a rope halter. Behind her came Ambrose Peck leading 2 5-year-old gray geldings that belonged to a man named Fetters at the head of the valley, got by Grey Tom in 1880 when Emmett was alive and nobody had ever heard of a syndicate. Behind them came Carell and his cousin with 3 more, borrowed that week off 3 different places, and behind them came 4 mares of Della's own, with foals at foot, and 1 yearling filly of Junie's that she led herself. 11 head, sired by the gray horse, aged from 4 months to 6 years, out of 11 different mares. And behind them, in a straggling line that took a full minute to come into the street, came the crooked ones. Ruth Halloran led Peg with the brown colt beside her. Anton Vasek was there with his black colt, and Anton Vasek had signed a release in December and had told his wife he was not going to town on the 4th, and had come anyway. There were 9 of them altogether, brought in by 9 men who had a great deal to lose by being seen in that line and had counted the cost on the way. They stopped the whole parade in front of the bank. Della Rourke walked the 11 straight-legged horses down the street past the black stallion, and turned them and brought them back, and stood them in a row along the front of the stockyard pens. And she did not say a word while she did it, and then she came back up the middle of the street and stopped. "Mr. Deshler," she said, and her voice carried. Because she had been calling cattle for 9 years, "Would you have Mr. Gorley walk your horse down that row?" Deshler said, pleasantly, "This is a holiday, Mrs. Rourke, it is, and every man in the county is here, which is why I picked it." She turned around, unhurried, and looked at the crowd. "Those 11 horses on my left are by my gray. Look down the front legs of every one of them. Look at the hocks. Ask the men who own them. They are standing right there. They are your neighbors. I did not pay them, and I could not if I wanted to. Those 9 on my right are by that black horse, and every man holding one of them paid $100 for the privilege." She let that sit. "Mrs. Halloran," she said, "tell them about Peg." And Ruth Halloran, standing in the middle of the street of Bellamy on the 4th of July, with her hand under the jaw of a brown mare, told 200 people about a 2-acre lot behind a house with a lamp in it, and 4 witnesses in a livery barn on the 11th of June, 1884, and a colt that stood like this, and she did the imitation, and nobody laughed at all. Then Della Rourke did the thing she had come to do. "There is a brand on the neck of my horse," she said. "It has been under his mane since before my husband bought him, and it came to light last summer when Mr. Deshler's men put a rope on him in my barn at 1 in the morning. It is a French house brand, and it carries a number, and the number is 41. I have a letter in my pocket that came 11 weeks on the water from the house that burned it." She unbuckled the halter and pushed the cropped mane back with her hand and turned the gray horse's near side to the street. "Come and look," she said. "Every one of you. Come and put your thumb on it. It will take you 10 seconds, and it is the only thing anybody in this valley has been asked to look at in 16 months that does not depend on believing me." For perhaps 4 seconds nothing happened. Then Salpetri came off the boardwalk, and Rundle, the boiler contractor, who happened to be in town, came after him, and then a Swede from the lower valley, and then it became a line. And the line went on for 20 minutes, and men put their thumbs on a white diamond with 2 letters inside it and a number under it, on the neck of a horse in the middle of a street, and walked away down the boardwalk, and stood in groups and talked, and the temperature of Ashford County changed permanently in the space of half an hour. Harlan Deshler stood beside his $4,000 stallion in the middle of it and did not leave, which Della afterward thought was the bravest thing she ever saw him do, and possibly the most stupid. At the end of it he crossed the street to her. The Clarion man came with him and was waved off. "You will not get it back," Deshler said quietly. "You understand that. The place goes on the 9th. Whatever else happens, whatever you have got in that envelope, it does not stop the sheriff on the 9th. "No," Della agreed. "It does not." "Then what have you bought with this?" 40 men who will not sign your release," said Della Rourke, "and a witness coming from Chicago at the expense of a French house, and a judge in Cheyenne who is going to be handed a document with a government stamp on it in a language he cannot read and will therefore take very seriously indeed." She put her hand on the gray horse's face. "And I have got 200 people who have touched that brand with their own thumbs." "You cannot get them all in a barn at 1 in the morning, Mr. Deshler." Ellis Mowbray was on the eastbound at 6 the next morning with the French papers in a leather satchel chained to his wrist, which Della thought was theatrical and which he defended for the rest of his life. He filed a bill in equity in the district court at Cheyenne on the 7th of July, 1886, on behalf of Della Rourke and 11 farmers of Ashford County, against Harlan Deshler, the Cottonwood Valley Norman Horse Company, and the Stockmen's National Bank of Bellamy, alleging fraud in the sale of shares, fraud in the registration of a stallion, and conspiracy to depress the value of the plaintiff Rourke's property in order to acquire it. Judge Alonzo Sharp read the certified extract from the shipping book of Pero Freres for a long time. He restrained the sheriff's sale on the 8th of July, at 4 in the afternoon, 17 hours before it was to be cried on the courthouse steps at Bellamy, and set the cause down for hearing at the October term. The cause of Rourke and others against Deshler and others was heard in the district court at Cheyenne beginning on the 19th of October, 1886, and it took 4 days. They shipped the horse. It cost $11 in a stock car on the through freight, 206 miles, and Ambrose Peck rode in the car with him the whole way sitting on a bale of hay with a 10-gauge across his knees, because Della Rourke had learned in July of 1885 what happened to that horse when nobody was standing beside him in the dark. Etienne Robichaud came up from Chicago with 2 ledgers wrapped in oilcloth and a letter of authority from Auguste Perot. He was a spare, courteous man of 60, with a white mustache and a French accent worn down by 30 years of the Union stockyards, and he had shipped, he told the court, something over 400 horses out of Nogent-le-Rotrou to America in his career, and had branded a good many of them with his own hands. Waldo Tenney came from the office of the stud book in Chicago, under subpoena, and he was not friendly to anybody. He brought the original application of December 1879 in the applicant's own hand. Marius Fenn testified for 2 hours on the heritability of crooked knees and sickle hocks, and on the examination he had made of 19 foals in Ashford County that summer, 16 by the Black Stallion, and 13 of the 16 defective in the same manner. Sol Petrie testified about hocks. Ruth Halloran testified about a 2-acre lot in the middle of Bellamy, and Deshler's attorney, a careful Cheyenne man named Ivers, made the mistake of suggesting to her that a woman might not recall the movements of one mare 2 years afterward, and Ruth Halloran told him where that mare had stood on every day of the summer of 1884 for 11 minutes without notes, and Judge Sharp had to ask her to stop. Ivers made 3 arguments, and they were the right 3. He argued that a brand 7 years old on a gray horse proved nothing but that some house in France had once owned some horse. He argued that no living man could identify an individual animal after 7 years and 2,000 miles. And he argued that whatever the customs clerk in New York had written, the register in Chicago was the legal record of the pedigree of the Stallion Vulcan. And the register said black. On the morning of the 3rd day, Judge Alonzo Sharp adjourned his court to the yard behind the courthouse. It was a bright, cold October morning, with the cottonwoods gone yellow, and there were perhaps 90 people in that yard, including the entire jury, the sheriff of Laramie County, 3 reporters, and 11 farmers from Ashford County who had come down on the cars at their own expense and slept in the stock pens. Ambrose Peck led the gray horse out of the livery and into the yard. Robichaud was sworn again standing on the grass. He was handed the shipping book of his own house and asked to read the entry for the horse numbered 41 in the campaign of 1879, first in French and then in English. And he did, and his voice was steady until he came to the last phrase, and then it was not. Gris pommellé, étoilé, épis aux côtes gauche de l'encolure. Dapple gray. A star. A whorl on the near side of the neck. Mr. Robichaud, said Ellis Mowbray, will you approach the animal? The old Frenchman walked up to a 1,900-pound stallion in a strange yard in a strange town, and put his hand on the horse's face the way a man does who has done it 400 times, and the horse stood. He found the star under the forelock and said so. He found the whorl, the little cowlick of hair on the left side of the neck, where the coat turns back on itself, which is on every horse somewhere, and is on no 2 horses in the same place, and which had been written down in a book in France in September of 1879 by a man who had never imagined that anyone would ever check. And then he pushed the cropped mane forward with the back of his hand and stood aside so that the jury could see, and said, "And here, messieurs, is my iron." Nobody in that yard said anything for a moment. Then Judge Sharp came down off the step he had been standing on, and walked over, and looked at the neck of the horse himself for a good while, and went back to his step. "Mr. Ivers," he said, "you may examine." Ivers did what he could. He got Robichaud to admit that he had not personally applied that particular iron, that the house employed 4 men who did it, and that he could not swear the horse had not been branded by somebody else at some other time. It was competent work, and it moved nothing, because 90 people had just watched a Frenchman find 3 marks in a row that had been written down in a ledger before any of it happened. Harlan Deshler took the stand at 2 o'clock that afternoon. He was 55 years old by then, and he had been on his feet in that courtroom for 3 days, and he looked, Della thought, exactly like a man who has been carrying a stone in his boot since 1879 and has decided to stop walking. Mowbray was very quiet with him. He did not raise his voice once. He put the customs entry in front of him. 1 stallion, gray, Consigny H. Deshler said the clerk was mistaken. He put the receipt from Le Havre in front of him. Deshler looked at his own signature for a while and said that he had signed a great many receipts in 1879. He put the day book of Ballard and Roan in front of him. 1 stallion horse, gray, French, in poor order, sold same day, E. Rourke, $65. And then Ellis Mowbray put down the application to the Percheron Norman Stud Book of America, dated the 2nd of December 1879, in Deshler's own handwriting, and asked him to read out the fourth line. And the fourth line said, "In the same hand as the signature on the receipt from Le Havre, color, black small star." "Mr. Deshler," said Mowbray on the 14th of October 1879, "you signed for a gray horse. On the 9th of November 1879, you sold a gray horse to Emmett Rourke for $65. On the 2nd of December 1879, you registered a black horse under the papers of the gray one. Did any other horse come to you from France that autumn?" The courtroom was extremely quiet. "No," Harlan Deshler said. Ivers came half out of his chair and sat down again. "He came off the cars in Chicago in the first week of November," Deshler said. He was not talking to Mowbray. He was looking at a point on the back wall of the courtroom above everybody's head. He had shipping fever. He had lost 200 pounds on the water and 200 more on the cars, and he stood in that pen with his head down and his ribs out and his eyes running. And he coughed like a man dying of it, and he was the best horse I ever had my hands on in my life, and anybody who knew horses could see it. And I had a buyer coming from Davenport on Thursday with a certified draft for $4,000, and a wife who wanted to see the horse." He stopped. "A sick horse does not sell," he said. "A black horse in a barn, sound and fat and worth $200, sells, so I moved the papers." And on Thursday, the man from Davenport did not come, because his bank had gone under on the Tuesday, and I was left with a scrub in a rented stall and $4,000 of paper on him, and a gray horse I had sold for $65, walking around Wyoming Territory in a plow harness. He looked then at Della Rourke, sitting in the second row in a blue dress, with her hands in her lap. And then his wife put a card on a fence post, he said, at $10 the season. Judge Alonzo Sharp handed down his decree on the 11th of December 1886. He found that the sale of shares in the Cottonwood Valley Norman Horse Company had been procured by fraud, declared every note given for a share void, and ordered them surrendered and canceled, declared the releases signed in December 1885 void as obtained by the same fraud, ordered restitution of $2,900 in cash paid by subscribers, with interest at 7%, dissolved the company, and set aside the acceleration of the Rourke note as having been procured by a director for a private purpose adverse to the borrower, restoring it to its annual installments and charging the costs of the whole cause to the defendants. He directed that a certified copy of the record be transmitted to the secretary of the Percheron Norman Stud Book of America. The register acted in March of 1887. The entry of the Black Stallion under the number 2117 was cancelled and stricken from the books, with a note of the reason in language that ended the black horse's public life forever. And upon the application of Mrs. D. Rourke of Bellamy, Wyoming Territory, supported by the certificate of the House of Perot Freres, the certified extract of the shipping book, the customs entry, and the sworn statement of Etienne Robichaud as to the brand, the gray stallion in her possession was recorded under his own name and number, the entry noting the house brand 41, the star and the whorl. Vulcane 2117. He was 10 years old, and for 6 of those 10 years he had been named after a man's dog and had pulled lumber for $2.50 a thousand feet. That winter was the winter of 1886 and 1887, the winter that killed the open range. It came down in November and did not let go until April, and when the Chinook finally came in the spring and the snow went off the flats, the cattle of the Wyoming and Montana territories lay dead in the coulees and along the drift fences in numbers that no one has ever counted properly, and the big outfits that had run 40,000 head on grass they did not own were finished, and a way of living in that country ended in about 90 days. Della Rourke lost 9 head of cattle out of 31. She did not lose a horse. Not one. Because a woman who has spent 2 years hauling lumber and putting up 90 tons of hay a summer for a stallion that eats 20 pounds a day feeds her stock in February, and because the horse business, unlike the cattle business, had never once been able to pretend that winter was not coming. In the spring of 1887, when the valley came out of it, there was not a man from the head of Cottonwood to the county line who wanted to be in the cattle business, and there were 160 farmers who wanted work colts. She stood him that season at $20 and $25 to insure, and booked 61 mares by the 1st of June, and turned away 19. The note at the Stockmen's National Bank was paid in full on the 4th of October, 1890, 4 years early, in a cashier's office where nobody said very much. Harlan Deshler had sold the mercantile in 1888 and gone to Portland. The Omaha house that held his own paper had come down on him within a month of the decree, and the men who had signed his notes in the Grange Hall in 1884 got their money back before he got out of the territory, which Ellis Mowbray always said was the only genuinely satisfying thing he ever accomplished in the practice of law. Mowbray went on the district bench in 1898. Saltpetre shod horses until 1894 and died in 1897 with his book paid up. Ambrose Peck died in the harness room in 1893, in his sleep, 60 feet from the stall, and is buried on the stony hill behind the barn that was never good for anything except that it broke the wind. Junie Rourke married a veterinary surgeon out of Iowa in 1896, which surprised nobody in Ashford County who had been paying attention, and took over the books. The gray horse stood every season for 13 years, and got 461 recorded foals in that valley, and there is a photograph, taken in 1897 for a stock catalog, of a heavy dapple gray stallion gone almost white, standing square in front of a barn, with a woman in a dark dress holding the lead at his head and not looking at the camera. He died in the pasture in August of 1899, at 23, in the sun, and they buried him on the hill by Ambrose. The certificate of registration from the Percheron Norman Stud Book of America came in the mail in April of 1887, in a long envelope, with a seal on it. Della Rourke carried it out to the barn and took a horseshoe nail out of a coffee tin on the shelf where it had been sitting for 2 years and drove it through the top of that certificate into the same door, into the same hole. Then she went and got the horse and stood him where he could see it, which was foolish, and she knew it was foolish, and she did it anyway.